All right, next we're going to be talking about what was being emphasized. And what we mean by that is how does the structure of the passage reveal what the author really wanted his audience to know, believe, feel, and do? And so we're going to be talking about structure. And as I mentioned in a previous video, the authors used, depending upon the genre, certain different kinds of structure to be able to emphasize certain kinds of things that he wanted his audience to be able to pay attention to see, and to be changed by. And so over these next 4 videos, we're going to actually look at structure in both narratives and epistles. And so let's dive in first to narratives, and we're going to spend 3 videos just talking about narratives. In the first video here, I want to give kind of an overview of kind of how narratives are structured, and then the next couple videos, then we're going to look at a couple different examples. And so narratives are primarily structured around 3 things: setting, characters, and plot. Just like any good story, because narratives are telling a story, they include these 3 elements: setting, characters, and plot. So let's think about setting a little bit. When we talk about setting, we're simply thinking about time, place, and environment. And the environment can be both physical and social. And so let's look at some examples here, to biblical examples of setting. And so 2 Samuel 11:1, this is a famous passage. It leads into this is the chapter of David and Bathsheba, David's sin with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband. And so it says this: in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. Okay, so stopping there's not, this sets up, of course, some things. We have certain characters that are there, and we have, in the spring, we have time. But there is an addition here at the very end of this little setting that is part of the setting. And it says, "But David remained at Jerusalem." Okay, so when David should have been out to war, David remained back in Jerusalem. We don't know exactly why. This is all that the narrator gives us, but this sets up now what leads to the rest of the story. Okay, another example of setting is in Ruth 1:1. In the days when judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to the sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, we got the time in the days of the judges, so it provides some context there. So in the days of the judges, if you know, that the period of the judges was characterized by Israel's ongoing rebellion. God would discipline them, would make life a bit difficult for them then, through different things, through either famine or through subjugation from different enemies. And then they would call out to him, they would repent. God would then send another judge, in his favor, in kindness, he would send another judge. And then eventually they would repeat the cycle over and over and over again. So you have this as part of the backdrop, as part of the setting here in Ruth 1:1. And so in this case, there was a famine. And so this man from Bethlehem, we don't have his name quite yet here, it's going to come out in the next few verses, and his sons and his wife went to Moab to escape the famine. Okay, so this is also interesting because even the word here, Bethlehem, it basically means house of bread. And so here they were living in the house of bread, but there was a famine, which again is ironic. And then they go to Moab, which is essentially their enemies. And so we're going to learn a lot more in the coming verses of who these people were. But then this man and his 2 sons are gonna die, and the story continues actually without them. But we have here a little bit of a setting in order to set up what's about to happen. Okay, Mark 4:35 is another example of on that day when evening had come, he, Jesus, said to them, his disciples, let us go across to the other side. So this is an example of, again, it's the time is in the evening. The characters are, and we'll talk about characters later, but Jesus and the disciples. But in the evening time, and it says here, when we go across the other side, the context is going across the Sea of Galilee. And so these disciples knew, though, as experienced fishermen, that there oftentimes were these storms that would come out of nowhere and descend into the Sea of Galilee. Sea of Galilee was below sea level, and so they would descend into this, and it would almost be like hurricane force winds and a storm that would overtake anybody, and they would usually happen at night, and would overtake anybody that was out on the sea. So this is the context then for Mark 4:35, and then Luke 7:36 through 37. Again, this is our story that we were looking at already. But one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment. And so again, you've got the different characters where, the setting, the characters of the Pharisee and this woman. The setting takes place in the Pharisee's house, which is kind of intimidating for, they were at this point beginning to oppose Jesus. And so here Jesus walks straight into this, knowing full well likely what was to happen, and Simon's heart in this, potentially to catch Jesus or to critique Jesus. And so, and again, this woman we don't know her name, I mentioned that before, we just know that she was a woman of the city who was a sinner. And so this again sheds light on the rest of the story and helps set up now what's about to happen. And so that's setting. We also want to think through characters. And again, I've already mentioned characters in a lot of these examples. Again, in 2 Samuel 11:1, Joab becomes a character that's, shows back up later in this narrative, but David is the main character. And then we haven't yet met another character, two other characters that are central to this, which is Bathsheba and her husband, Uriah. And so, anyway, so characters are important here. We want to pay attention to characters. These aren't throwaway names, but God is, the author and narrator is using these names to be able to set up these stories. Again, Ruth 1:1, we have the characters of the husband and the wife and the two sons. Now again, the two sons and the husband are all going to die within the next few verses. And the wife, who is named Naomi, we don't have her name here yet in verse 1, but Naomi, it begins to be the main character that runs all the way through this book of Ruth. But then we're also not yet introduced to the two daughters-in-law, and one of which is Ruth, who journeys then back to Jerusalem with Naomi. So again, we want to pay careful attention. Now, the other thing that we would want to pay attention to is when we are introduced to these daughters-in-law, where are they from? Are they Israelites or are they Moabites? And why is that important, one way or the other? And so we want to think through these characters and dive in as much as we can to understanding who they are. Again, Mark 4:35, we've got the disciples and we've got Jesus. And as I mentioned earlier, knowing just a little bit more about these disciples, we know that they were fishermen, they were seasoned, they knew how to navigate these seas. They also potentially were a bit afraid of going through over at night, even though they've been on the sea at night. But also at the same time, these were guys who knew how to navigate tough terrain. But this must have been a ferocious storm that got them so scared that they were fearful for their own lives. And so again, knowing the characters again, it helps us to imagine and enter into the story a little bit more. And then again in Luke 7, the character of Simon the Pharisee and the woman who was a sinner. The other characters that aren't introduced yet in these two verses are the crowd. that we see at the very end of the story, that we're observing this whole thing, and we're wondering then, after Jesus forgave, who this was, who could even forgive sins. Then we want to think through plot. And plot, we want to think through, every story has three parts to it: the beginning, middle, and end. And in the beginning of the story, we have the setting. And so again, a lot of these verses would be that setting, where it's setting it up. There's not necessarily tension in the setting, or the beginning, or in the setting. But every good story has some kind of tension. There's something that happens in the story that begins to move the story forward, and that tension is what moves the story forward. In our minds, we begin to wonder, how is this going to be resolved? Where is this going? And that tension is what's actually, this is really what the story is about. Because that tension then leads in the middle of a story to the crisis or a climax, where the tension reaches its peak, and then there is some kind of resolution or a turning point in the story at that point, where something happens where that tension is released because of what happens then. Some kind of, it's fixed, or the story was going one way, and all of a sudden now it goes a different direction, and it's resolved. And so we want to think through and look at our stories in a way, and biblical writers did this, to look at these stories in such a way where we notice, what is the tension that's driving this story? What's the crisis, the highest point of tension, or the climax, and then how is that story resolved, or what's the turning point in the story? And then at the end, there are usually some sorts of following actions or lessons. And so with that, what I want to do in the next videos is I want to walk through a couple of examples in the next few videos, both Genesis 21, which is a new passage that we haven't looked at yet, and then Luke 7.